Thanks everyone for coming out. And as Lauren mentioned, I do the AWS and Azure user groups. I've taken kind of a hiatus during November and December. We'll be starting that back up in January. So if you have any interest in the cloud, we'll be starting that up. Also just started up a Google Cloud Platform, a GCP user group. Unlike AWS, Amazon, and Microsoft, Google actually interviews you if you want to start one of their user groups. So it's a video interview, and they're pretty strict on that, but I'm starting that up. So if anyone has any interest in GCP, be watching for that on meetup.com. So a little about me, you'll see that mostly I've been a paper pusher most of my life, but I'm passionate about the cloud, passionate about digital transformation, and passionate about DevOps. And one of the reasons is I spent 19 years at Bell's running infrastructure the old-fashioned way. You'd hire your very expensive CIEs, you'd hire your expensive SAN engineers, you'd rack and stack, and at the time figured we racked and stacked it better than anyone else in the business. And then you mature a little bit, you realize, you know what, that doesn't really differentiate your business, and the cloud is a lot better way to go. But I had a lot of fun doing that. Then I was the CIO at Lazy Days, big on-prem shop, a Microsoft shop. They were very anti-cloud at that minute, and they sold RVs. So they spent a lot of time provisioning hardware. They spent a lot of time doing Windows administration. But when your job is to sell RVs, you don't really need a lot of IT staff. So I helped them move back to AWS, redid their website, rolled out mobile applications to their sales staff. Had a lot of fun doing that. Went down to Fort Lauderdale, helped run IoT on a lamp stack in AWS. We were doing IoT in terms of RFID on apparel labels on clothing, and we had the concept of a smart fitting room. So if you walked into a fitting room with clothing on, it would know what size, what color you had. It would be a touch screen. It would tell you what other sizes and colors were available. It would alert the sales associate. It was a startup division of a billion-dollar Japanese company. The problem was when you sell to large retailers that have thousands of stores and you want to put in $3,000 worth of hardware in every store, that's a massive multi-million-dollar purchase. And so that's a long sales cycle. And so after a couple of years, and it said the technology is cool, but we can't keep funding that process. But we had a fun time doing that. I was at a Digital Media Solutions over in Clearwater, very small company, maybe about 100 million, and they had assets spread across 6 different cloud providers. They did a lot of M&A, did a lot of acquisitions. Every time they acquired a company, they had a different cloud provider. We had about 700 websites that we needed to manage. We had about 15 different DNS providers, 6 or 7 different cloud providers. So when our website died, they really didn't know where that website was hosted. They didn't understand what port it would go to, so help them move everything to AWS and move into Agile development. I was at Ashley Furniture until about 6 months ago. Went back to retail for some reason. That's tough during the holidays. But we had about 1,500 VMs that we ran on-prem, all virtualized on VMware. We got through about 350 of those, moved those up to Azure when I got an opportunity to join Green Pages. They said, I wasn't looking for a job. They said, Jeff, would you like to make more money, not manage 35 people anymore, work from home when you want, we'll pay you to get certified, less stress, what do you think? And I said, that sounds good, let's do that. So the agenda, I think we all saw on meetup.com. So just a quick question. I know how many people here, I was going to say QA roles, it's most everyone, but who's not in a QA role right now? Okay. So some of you, which is good, because I'm not a QA person, so the QA people keep me honest if you're an expert. How many people here are in a DevOps role? All right, so Lee, what is DevOps? Define DevOps to us. Exactly. See, that's the point. Because we're going to talk about that. It's like the cloud. It can mean anything you want it to mean. I just like put people. And who's here for the free food? That's okay. I am too. So waterfall methodology. This was mostly how I grew up doing waterfall methodology. And I am guilty as anyone knowing that testing, I started off doing development, then I moved to infrastructure, and I thought QA testing was bad. I hated the testers. because I figured I wrote good code. I am kind of curious, so how many people here are in companies that have not yet adopted Agile and are doing Waterfall, long, lengthy development? Anyone doing that anymore? Which is good. Okay, we won't spend much time on that. I came from a $6 billion company. I would say only the e-commerce division was doing Agile and DevOps, and we had 200 people still doing that lengthy waterfall methodology. So it's good that everyone here is hip to the time. So traditional QA testing, even if you automated, I see a lot of companies at Green Pages, a lot of companies come to us, even if they do have a pretty robust CI/CD pipeline, they haven't really automated QA testing. So all the way up to a build is automated, and then they dump it in a QA environment, hand it over the wall, and hand it to QA. So out of everyone here, just to give me a feel for the audience, how many people here are not doing automated testing as part of a CI/CD pipeline, no automated testing? It's all kind of back end. So old school QA, this was always the bane of my existence. You shall not deploy. What I've seen in a lot of companies is QA is kind of the last hoop you have to jump through. The project's running late. You got to launch that website update right before the Christmas holidays. QA was supposed to have 3 days in the sprint to test. Now you only have 4 hours. I lived that a lot. Anyone have that problem here in QA, or does everyone have enough time to do all the testing they need to do?
It's all automated.
Yeah. So DevOps gives you the opportunity to kind of get out of that problem. So this was interesting to me because I don't always see these numbers when we talk to a variety of companies and the companies that I've helped manage. But Gartner says 88% of companies have adopted Agile. That doesn't mean Agile everywhere. That means some aspect of that company, some development group is doing Agile. 70% of the companies have adopted the concept of DevOps that we're going to talk about tonight. What's surprising to me is out of all that, 26% have adopted test automation. Does that seem pretty similar to what people have seen out there? Does that ring true?
The test automation has gone more easily. Maybe some of the other ways not to.
It's growing a lot, though.
Yeah, I think
very quickly.
I think it's slowly coming around, which is good because we see a lot of companies, even large companies, have come to us at Green Pages and said, "Boy, we love the CI/CD. Everything that is net new development we're doing in the DevOps CI/CD pipeline." But they have never automated the testing, and that is the last thing that they want to add. What's surprising to me, this is from a GitLab report last year, what is the development process you encounter the most delays in? Everyone says testing. So it's just surprising to me. They don't automate it, but they realize what a pain it is. And to me, part of the challenge, I think, is QA doesn't always have a seat at the table. You know, the developers are kind of running the DevOps program. They're setting up the pipeline. They're deciding what aspects to put in the pipeline. And I'm not convinced QA always has an equal voice in setting up that pipeline. So I sometimes when I research a topic, I kind of like to do a baseline. I use Google Trends. You can find out how common it is for someone to search on a word. Such as impeachment, I suppose. So I used Agile development. This is really on a relative scale. 100 means that's when you had the peak number of searches. Agile development's kind of tailoring off. It's pretty mature at this point. People really know what's going on. If I look at DevOps really just started being a topic of interest in around 2012. It's still reaching its peak of interest. A lot of people interested in DevOps. And then this is not the scale, but I was interested. How many people are saying, what is DevOps? And, that's clearly not a mature methodology. Everyone's saying, what the heck is DevOps? And I'm not here necessarily to give you the actual answer, but I'll give you my perspective after being in the business for quite a while. So how did DevOps come about? Just a little bit of history. In 2007, Patrick Dubois was doing a project. He was doing some data center consolidation. He was working with the system admins. That's not a cool word anymore, but we used to call people system admins. And he was working with developers. And what drove him crazy was the disconnect between the system admins representing operations and the developers. And there was such a big disconnect and so little communication going back and forth that he figured there has to be a better way to do that. In 2008, Andrew Schaefer at an Agile conference created a birds of a feather session, and he called that Agile infrastructure. It was so poorly attended, he didn't see anyone who had written that they wanted to attend. Andrew didn't even go to his own session, but Patrick showed up. And at least the two of them knew there was two people interested in the concept of Agile infrastructure. And so they got together and created I think back in the time, it was maybe a Yahoo group. I can't remember, it was popular back in 2008. But they started gaining interest on people talking about Agile infrastructure. There's got to be a better way to do this. 2009, Flickr presented 10 plus deploys a day. I believe they called that Dev and Ops cooperation. So Flickr was talking about how, and this is really the first time a company publicly said, we are working together to solve this and create a partnership. In 2010, US DevOps Days was held here in the US, and I'll talk about that in a minute. That's really how the concept of DevOps and why that term is being used today. 2013, anyone familiar with the Phoenix Project? It's a fictional story about an individual who was tasked to clean up a project for a manufacturing company, and he partners with a member of the board of directors who talks about lean manufacturing, and he gives really some thought to, and it really speaks to the concept of DevOps and how he turned that project around. So if you're interested in DevOps, I suggest that's a good book to read, and still relevant. Came out in 2013, but still pretty relevant today. So DevOps today, I would argue that there's a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and there's a fear of missing out. It's still pretty unclear, but hopefully we can cut through some of that mud tonight. So why do we call it DevOps? In 2009, Flickr said Dev and Ops cooperation. October 2009, Patrick organized the DevOps Days event. He needed it to be a short moniker. He used DevOps Days because Agile System Administration wasn't very sexy. He wanted to market this event. No one wants to go to an event called Agile System Administration. That sounds very nerdy. He needed a Twitter hashtag. DevOps Days was too long as a Twitter hashtag, so he used DevOps on Twitter, and he then was responsible for all of us calling it DevOps today. A little bit of trivia there.
Didn't only one person show up to that first meeting that he did? One person
One
showed
person,
up.
yep.
In the whole room, he had the whole thing there. One guy showed up.
Exactly.
He got the ball rolling though.
So why is DevOps the thing? If you look at waterfall development, and I was in projects when I was at Bell's that might take 9 months to roll out, a year and a half to roll out. And operations could be slow moving. If you're only going to push changes to production once or twice a year, you really don't have to be nimble on the operation side. You can be fat and happy and still keep everyone content. But here comes Agile development. So instead of pushing a code deploy every 6 months, all of a sudden, if you've got a 2-week sprint, and I've worked for companies that we had daily sprints, so we were pushing 1 or 2 changes to a website each day. The reason we were doing that, we had customers like Uber, and you could make a change to a website that would bring in an extra, let's say, $300,000, $500,000 that day. So I promise you, they would settle for a little instability to grab that $500,000 today as opposed to that $500,000 tomorrow. And you really don't want to upset a company like Uber, so you just keep pushing, and if there's damage, you fix that quickly. So here comes Agile. You push in deploys at least every 2 weeks, and that's a problem. So I would say DevOps is not about tools, it's certainly about culture. Agile development is about short sprints, rapid change. If you're going to fail, just fail fast, but differentiate the business, and it's all about deploy, deploy, deploy. On the operations side, and I was in development for a while, but my last 7 years at Bell's, I was a CTO, and sometimes your bonus is tied to uptime. Sometimes your bonus is if you are 99.99% average uptime, you get a nice size bonus. And so do you really want change being introduced into your environment if your bonus is based on uptime? Do you want someone to slap some unstable code into your production environment? Not necessarily. So operations often is taught and rewarded to look for stability, the steady state environment, zero downtime, and slow development cycles. And so you really have two different companies being held to two different motivations. You can't reward one group and say, you're all about fast change, and that's how we're going to look at your value to the business, and have another group where you're teaching them, you want stability, you don't want change, fight change, create change management processes, create hard, difficult, let's say, change management boards. Let's make it difficult for change to be introduced. And so that presents a lot of conflict. So why do we need agile operations? As I said, dev teams, it's all about innovation, speed to market, change is good. Op teams are saying stability, reliability, predictability, change is bad. At the end of the day, you've got customers, whether they're internal or external, whether you want to differentiate your business. That's the choking point. Ops teams are in the way. So something had to happen. So agile development grew from a tortoise into a hare, and operations was still moving at glacier speed, and that's just not going to work. You're either going to be outsourced if you're operations, or you got to figure out a new way to do things. And I'm not a good Photoshop person, but I have to say, I did a decent job of making that rabbit look like he was actually positioned there. If you squint, it actually looks pretty good. So I'm used to old school operations environment where you had months and months to work on anything you were working on. And so you had specialists. You had your network engineers providing input to the network and to the VLANs and to the routing, making sure that was stable. You had your server admins. You had QA and the security team, making sure that project was okay. You had your storage engineers, making sure your SAN was configured for high-speed access, and you didn't have any hot areas on your SAN with I/O contention. But here comes going to the cloud quite often, and here comes agile operations. You've got a small team. You don't have that experience anymore. You may have a lot of individuals that are mostly developers, maybe very little network background, maybe little knowledge of storage and RAID, maybe very little knowledge about security and QA. And through my career and through Green Pages, we see this a lot. That in companies, you've got a well-established operations group for everything running on-prem. Companies move to the cloud. They've got this new DevOps group. Everything's happening quickly, but they're forgetting about QA. They're forgetting about security. They're forgetting about disaster recovery and high availability. And so ultimately, what is happening is all that structure, discipline, and best practices you had on-prem is slowly but surely coming over to the world of DevOps. We're not quite there yet, but we're certainly getting there. So what is DevOps? I had asked Lee. Lee was probably going to spout something like this. I went on to the Amazon website. This is just a bunch of verbiage. Doesn't really mean a whole lot. So I would say you don't have to worry about that. Gartner, who I used to believe a lot in Gartner. Anyone respect what Gartner puts out?
Nope.
Well, when we were doing IoT, Gartner said, boy, we want to do a write-up. You guys have some sexy technology with RFID and apparel, everything you're doing with mobile development. We want to do a write-up for you. And we said, great, so how do we arrange that? Well, you have a 6-figure contract that you need to sign. As soon as we get your money, we'll do a write-up on you. And I thought, that's how you get written up in Gartner, is you pay to play. I think they still have good information out there, but you do have to pay to make sure that they recognize you. Again, just a bunch of verbiage. I think that's a dumpster fire. Lastly, I've got Microsoft's definition. This is really saying DevOps has, if you're doing something to make something better, it smells like DevOps is really what they're saying. And so I'm saying that's a little bit of word vomit. I wouldn't worry about that either. So here's the definition from simple people, and I try to consider myself to be a simple person. I think if Patrick Dubois had used a hashtag called Agile Ops, it'd be a lot easier for us to understand. Because when people say DevOps, they're like, oh, that's development and operations. And then the security people said, oh, that's not right? Let's do DevSecOps. And then someone says, yeah, but testing's supposed to be in there, so why don't we call it DevTestSecOps? And ultimately, it's all of us just being agile.
I have another definition.
Yep.
DevOps is everything as a service. Your network give you network as a service. Your database give you database as a service. Your security give you security as a service. And then you as a developer can plug it in together.
What if I'm not using database as a service? What if I'm in the cloud and I'm using IaaS and I'm doing rolling my own SQL Server in my
Then you have
DevOps?
the same database as a service from the cloud.
Yeah. I mean, that's the great thing about DevOps, right? There's no right or wrong answer. It has a lot of different meanings, so you're absolutely right. So what is DevOps to me? To me, DevOps is more of a mindset and a culture. It's respect, trust, understanding the opposite side. I grew up on the development side. Every time we had a problem, and I helped Bells launch their first website, and I remember we got one order a day. But you never saw anyone as happy as me, and this is back when the internet was first coming about, but you're happy with that one order. The same person would order every day, and on day 4, we didn't hear from her, and we actually wanted to drive to her house because she was the only person ever ordering it. Mary, are you okay? What's going on? But then I moved over to the infrastructure side, and it's interesting, my point of view as a developer was it's always a network issue, or it was a firewall issue, it was a storage issue, and then I was put in charge of infrastructure, and guess what? The infrastructure is solid. It's the developers that really have the problem, because they're writing crappy code. So I think DevOps is really understanding. We all are doing the best we can. We all have challenges. We all have different motives in terms of what is driving us and what our responsibilities are. But I think DevOps really is everyone getting together saying, look, we are all here to make a positive difference. We are here to push change, to push positive change, and just trying to get rid of that silo mentality to say, you know what, I'm in charge of the network and I decide if your application is good enough to write on it. So I think it's all about mutual cooperation and collaboration. Doesn't have to mean a small group. It's interesting, this company started a group called DevOps, and I say that a little tongue-in-cheek. We were called DevOps at Ashley Furniture because my group thought it would be cool to be called DevOps. My argument was no one in the company really knows what you guys do, but it looks good on a resume. But it doesn't have to be a group called DevOps. I don't think it's a new person called a DevOps engineer necessarily. I do think it encourages you to wear multiple hats. If you're a developer, sometimes you have to think like a tester. Sometimes you have to think like a network person. Sometimes you have to think like an infrastructure person and the other way around. I think it's making sure that people are not rewarded just for the silo. So you can't hold someone to 99.99% uptime as an annual bonus incentive if you're trying to drive constant change. So I think as IT leaders, sometimes we have to be cognizant of the fact that how you reward people's behavior sometimes can negatively impact the net result that you're getting from your IT department. So a lot of people seem to say, well, is DevOps really replacing Agile? I kind of like this diagram I stole via Google. So Agile really, obviously, as most of you guys know, is just based on development. DevOps is from development all the way out to production and testing. That sweet spot that sometimes we all ignore is right there, sometimes in the middle, but we're hoping we all push that to the left, right? Everyone wants QA to be earlier and earlier in the pipeline, although I think I talk about this later. So I'm all for moving testing, doing the shift left, as they say, but it's been my experience that not a lot of companies kind of shift the testing to the right. I've worked for a lot of companies where we pushed web changes on a frequent basis. It was alarming to me how you can have websites driving hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue, and when you push to production, there was no testing. It's like, well, yeah, but it worked in staging. Well, what if it doesn't work in production? So let me ask this. How many people here that are testers, how many of you test after something goes to production? Is that common, uncommon? Anyone not test in production? It's okay to raise your hand. Yeah. The other thing, I think I talk about this also, is just to check out performance. Every time you make changes to, let's say, website code, you assume you're making those changes and performance gets better. What we did at Ashley Furniture is we used Rigor to do a lot of instrumentation of our website. So every time we pushed a change out, we'd kick out some performance tests so we knew, and with rigor, we could actually say change 1, 2, 3 went in, and that was shown on the performance chart. And when you looked at that performance, you would know, hey, I just changed something last Tuesday. And since last Tuesday, the average checkout time on our website has doubled. So sometimes it's nice to check performance. I've also seen a lot of companies, you have a net new development project, the database starts relatively small. And that's all well and good. And then a year later, all of a sudden, queries are timing out. And people say, what changed? Nothing changed yesterday. Well, what changed is you didn't have many indexes. That table scan that used to be great isn't good anymore. And now all of a sudden, that table scan, because you have millions of rows, is taking a long time. But that shouldn't be a surprise if you're looking at performance of your queries over time. You should see a gradual degradation of those kind of performance issues. And so a lot of that I still see in production. A lot of the testing I know is focused on development and the QA environment, but I'd encourage everyone, don't forget about customer experience, because that's also an important trait to measure.
So Jeff, one thing I would like to add is here production support is not only the IT support guys, it is beyond that, like even the business operations support as well.
Yeah.
So when you really look at it, right, so you put something in the production, maybe in the testing says, oh, everything was successful, 0 defects and everything. It goes to the production, the call center guy is doing overtime because the number of calls has gone up. So obviously this guy may be getting rewarded. Oh, we did something great job in testing, but somebody else is suffering. And how do we really close that gap? It is not only within the IT, but beyond IT. Even your business
absolutely.
operations.
Yeah, and even at Ashley, before we got better at instrumentation, that would happen. We'd do an all-nighter, we'd push code out, we'd all celebrate, we'd all go home, and someone missed something, and the call center would be swamped.
Yeah.
And I had to try to reach out and say, customers can't check out of the store. And it's like, what do you mean? It was fine when we pushed it.
Functioning as designed.
No, good point,
Works
exactly.
on my machine, right?
Yeah. Or we'd say, it's the customer's browser. Tell them to reboot their PC. Tell them to clear out those cookies.
Yep.
That's always a cookie issue.
I remember I did a project with Amex. So we are rolling out their membership rewards program for different markets. That is kind of their main differentiator, right, for Amex. And we had a company called Frequency Marketing who sold the product for that. Every time we raise a defect, the only answer is, no, this is functioning as designed. What the heck? What does it mean functioning as designed? Doesn't work for me.
It's an undocumented feature, is what Microsoft usually says. So this is, I've experienced this firsthand. Hey, it worked fine in development. You guys on the operations side, you deal with it. And it always killed me, because when you're in charge of infrastructure staff, you're taking those calls at midnight. You're taking those calls on the weekends, and the developers who wrote the somewhat sloppy code are just out there hanging out with their families, enjoying a drink, and we're trying to put out the house fire that happened that weekend. So a lot of times people thought makers and caretakers, the development people make it, and ops has to just babysit it and the caretakers. And DevOps is trying to get rid of that analogy. Dev would throw something over the wall, then all of a sudden something breaks, the CIO or the CEO or the CFO is like, what's going on? And then you get the blame game. It worked fine on my development box, it must be an operations issue. This is what problem solving, I've experienced this too before DevOps. There's a problem, everyone's freaking out, and everyone already starts posturing. I knew those storage guys, I knew that operations, I knew that new firewall wasn't going to be any good. And everyone starts blaming, you do a lot of CYA with your boss, you do a lot of whining, you finally figure out. But there's a lot of back and forth, and a lot of wasted emotion and wasted time. DevOps is all about, hey, we've got an issue, let's get together and solve it. It doesn't matter if it's Susie's problem, it doesn't matter if it's Billy's problem. We're all in it together, we shipped it together, we worked on development together, let's just figure it out. And it's not always a kumbaya moment with everyone singing around a campfire, but it can certainly be a lot better than it has been in the past. So DevOps to me is really a change in the development process. If you're speeding up development, you've got to speed up the way that operationally you're going to handle that change. And you've got to be a little more supportive of quick and rapid change. And what you want is makers and makers. And as we move to infrastructure as code, you could say that the DevOps aspect of operations is becoming more development. Everything's code. It is surprising to me, though, now that I work for a service provider, as we talk to more and more companies about the cloud, even those companies that might have a $2 million a year, $3 million a year cloud budget really aren't doing infrastructure as code. You know, they're sitting at a portal, clicking away, designing their networks with a click of a mouse. Like at some point, you need to start doing infrastructure as code. And that way, operations will become a little more developers, and maybe that'll bring everyone closer together also. What DevOps is not, it's not about tools, and apologies to anyone who's very passionate about tools. I've had someone report to me before, and used to have dreams about chocolatey and nougat, and I thought he was dreaming about candy, and he was more passionate about the tools that he was using than the concept of DevOps and how he's improving the business. So I would argue it's not about the tools, it's really about processes, and it's about people. Not a new department, it's not a new type of person, it really is culture, and I think that culture has to start from the top, at least to be most successful. A lot of people think about devs and CAMs. CAMs will help you think about what DevOps really is. The aspect of culture, people over process over tools. Tools are just a means to an end. Your favorite tool today might not be there tomorrow. But again, it's about the processes. And when you're going to build a CI/CD pipeline, as anxious as you may be to start thinking about tools first, I would encourage everyone, think about the processes, think about the outcomes you want, then think about the tools you need to get there. Automate everything as much as you can. You certainly don't want to try to bite off too much in the beginning, but automation is clearly where everyone's headed. Not just because it's more efficient, but you want that repeatable success. And that's why we encourage companies to do infrastructure as code. If you have to stand up a new environment and you want to treat your servers as cattle instead of pets, Riley, you need to be able to repeat that. And so scripting is really a new way of life for everyone. Measure, monitor everything. It's surprising to me how many companies, they measure infrastructure. You're looking at CPU utilization, you're looking at your IOs, you're looking at memory utilization. And so we have, let's say you have an application problem and the help desk is reporting there's an issue, or everyone in finance says there's an issue, and someone on the infrastructure or DevOps side says, memory's good, CPU's good, it's not our fault. But they're not measuring APIs. It could be that you've got an API issue, and I supported point of sale for Ashley Furniture for a lot of stores, and the last thing you want are slow registers when it comes to Black Friday. And so one of the things we did when I got there is to not just instrument the infrastructure, but instrument all the APIs, especially if it's a third-party API, because it's amazing around peak periods around the holidays how many times your trusted partners are falling down on their APIs. And sometimes being able to know it's not your own code that's failing, it's a third-party API endpoint, you can get on that phone call a lot easier and start raising some cane to say, look, your service level is X. Clearly, you guys are outside of the parameters of our SLA. So keep in mind when you start doing some instrumentation as testers, certainly you have a voice at the table to say, hey, we need to start monitoring this, because you can be buggy and have that result in poor performance just as you can. It's a bug that won't let someone complete a transaction. And it's about sharing, collaboration, and feedback. And feedback doesn't mean to say you suck or I think you're an asshole. Feedback is, hey, there's an opportunity to make things better. Let's do that. So what's this DevOps CI/CD pipeline thing? Basically, this is in a nutshell. I'd say the most important aspect of a pipeline is the build, but you're going to grab some code, you're going to build it, hopefully you unit test it, you're going to deploy it. You might go ahead and do some other automated testing. You might do some regression testing. At some point, you deploy to production, and hopefully, you're going to do some measuring and some validation once you push it to production, because that's really where user experience comes into play. So people talk about continuous integration, continuous delivery. Sometimes CD, people mean continuous deployment. To me, if you're going to automate, why not automate deployment? I've seen a lot of companies where when it comes time to deploy, they're like, yeah, Jimmy does that, and Jimmy's offshore, and we have to push this emergency patch through, and we can't reach Jimmy. and Jimmy has a notepad, and Jimmy has all the instructions on how to deploy this application. But the rest of it's automated except for that final deploy. But this is just a representation. So continuous integration obviously is all about code, making sure that you're doing those constant builds. Hopefully you're doing your testing there. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then constant delivery, constant deployment obviously is there too. And I see a lot of companies with on-prem systems, they're really not interested in moving to CI/CD pipelines. But as soon as they move to the cloud, because that's a net new environment and it's an easy way for them to separate the old operations staff from the new developers, they say, you know what, we're going to do CI/CD for all cloud development, and we're going to stay old school with the on-prem systems.
What is CI/CD stands for?
CI is continuous integration. So let's suppose every time you do a checkout, and I'm not a developer, so I'm going to mangle this, but you check out, let's say you're going to work on a feature branch, so you check out some code. You're going to make some changes. You're going to check that in, right? So the question is, when do you want to get feedback that your code is not up to par? Do you want to wait till the end of a sprint and someone does a merge and all of a sudden you got chaos? Or is it going to build? Are you going to go ahead and do a push and then the build starts? And if you have some crappy code, you're going to find out right then instead at the end of the sprint, because finding out, the day before you go live at the end of a sprint is probably a little too late.
You don't want to run
Branches,
whole
you know,
CI
to bring
pipeline
back.
for hotfix, right?
Mhm.
You don't want to run whole pipeline for hotfix, right?
No.
In which case, you guys run whole CI/CD pipeline before production only,
Right.
pre-release. Okay.
Yep. And there's no right or wrong way. To me, the focus really is on automation, and it's like the cloud. There's a million different ways to migrate to the cloud. I'm more about process and procedure and collaboration than any specific, right or wrong way. So what are some key aspects of continuous integration? Developers, you want them to check and code more frequently. You want to do automatic builds and run some unit tests. Timely feedback to the developer. How many people here is it, and I ask this because a lot of times, even my last company, Ashley Furniture, we still hadn't gotten around to unit testing in our code. So you guys can educate me. Unit testing, is that the norm nowadays? Is that half the companies do, half the companies don't? How many people here do unit testing built into the code? All right.
Probably, like not whole code,
But getting there. Getting there.
I worked for other companies too that completely disregarded it too. So.
And when they disregard it, what's the motivation? Is that because it makes the developer less productive, right? It's a trade-off. We'll just risk the bug because that takes time for me to build in my unit.
Like,
Because it's such a small incremental change going through the CD part of it, it's very easy to go back and see it through the automation in your pipeline.
Yeah. So benefits are pretty obvious there why you'd want continuous integration. Sample tools. Continuous deployment or continuous delivery. Easy and automated deployment into production. This becomes a little more important when you are scaling up, let's say, using AWS or Azure, and you're set to auto scale, and anytime you deploy, you may have 2 web servers, you may have 20, you may have 30. I've seen environments where I see someone manually pushing code out to 15 web servers. And I'm like, how do you know you hit them all? It's like, well, when someone calls, there's a problem, I'm going to look to see which of the 15 isn't working right. And so, when you have more than 1 or 2 servers, that's where, continuous deployment, automated deployment starts to look pretty attractive. And at least with the cloud technologies, it's pretty easy to go ahead and when a server is deployed, have it grab the most recent code and auto-install that when it brings itself into service underneath the load balancer. So benefits, low risk releases, faster time to market. I've seen companies that used to cringe every time they did a deploy to production, so they always had IT do it at 2 a.m. because that's when the least number of people are on the website. And after a while, you're like, really? Can we solve this deployment issue? Because doing deployments at 2 a.m. is a little problematic for us. So infrastructure as code, I spoke to that a little bit. It's amazing to me how many companies are not doing that. Why do you want to do that? It enforces compliance with standards. If you always want to enable logging, and we see this a lot, if you have servers running on-prem, someone somewhere was responsible for setting up the security. So all of your event logs on Windows, all of your firewall logs, all of that has been being centrally collected and monitored. All of a sudden you move to the cloud, and you're like, who's patching your Windows servers? And the DevOps group says, and they haven't patched them for a year. And why? Because someone on-prem was responsible for patching the Windows servers or the Linux servers, but they kind of forgot to do that in the cloud. And so if you want to enforce compliance, every time you provision a server, it's good to do that with code, because you can actually have that configuration done ahead of time and make sure it's done the right way. How am I doing on time?
Be great.
Okay. So recommendations, the less tools, the better. I've had a number of people work for me that were very passionate about having the best of breed all the time. Again, I think the less tools, the better. I have a slide coming up that talks about the top CI/CD pipelines. I think, if you look at Microsoft or Azure DevOps now, if you look at AWS, slowly but surely those cloud providers are going to keep improving their CI/CD tools. You're going to see some of the other tools like a Jenkins become less and less popular as the cloud providers provide better results. And at Ashley, we were all Jenkins all the time. And the decision was made above us that, hey, we are a Microsoft shop, so we are going to ride Azure DevOps. And I can't say it was a bad thing, but I think as companies more and more move to the cloud, the fact that your CI/CD pipeline just comes out of the box right there.
And it's also very tool agnostic anymore.
It is.
Azure is tool agnostic,
Yeah.
so you can
I've
bring
seen-
whatever you want to the table and it still works.
Absolutely.
So-
I've seen companies use Azure
look at
DevOps
your-
to deploy to AWS.
Yeah, when you look at your tenant costs now versus going to Jenkins and throw it in there.
Yep. And it's basically CI/CD as a service at that point. In terms of priority, make sure you do your build. I would say production deploy. You obviously would want that scripted and not done manually. Unit test is nice to add in there. Then anything else you want to throw in there. But the build and the production deploy would be the areas that I would focus on. So I did a lot of Google searches just to see what everyone listed as the top tools. Who here is using Checkins if you're doing CI/CD? Who's using something else? And is it on the list?
Azure
Team
CI.
CD.
Oh,
What's-
Team CD as well.
TeamCity, yeah.
Heroku? I mean, Heroku has their own CI.
Yeah, I just didn't see it listed. I thought it was interesting that maybe not code pipeline, it's not as mature. I think the big difference between Azure and AWS is Microsoft understands developers a little more. They've been doing it a long time. Amazon doesn't quite get that yet. Not because they don't want to, they're just newer to the game when it comes to enterprise support and developer support. But I was surprised that Azure DevOps wasn't in there
That's a
somewhere.
good tool.
Yeah,
Azure CI.
and it's getting better.
Yeah.
Definitely getting better. So DevOps sometimes ignores testing. It's amazing how many times I'll just do a search for DevOps and you look at all the images and all the symbols and the testing isn't even on there. Why is that? Is that because testing is just handled automatically out of the box by DevOps? Do the cloud providers all do the testing? It's amazing to me how you can write this, anyone who has a background in technology, and say, well, testing, we don't need to put that there.
So I think there is a probably one way to look at is nobody wants to look at testing in a silo anymore. So testing is part of everywhere, right? During your requirements or when you're designing, when you're building, everything is, testing is integrated. You do not just have a testing phase like, okay, 2 months, just do testing, right?
Yeah.
Because you're talking about 2-week sprint. So just done at every step and,
I agree with you. That's where we all want to get. I just wonder how many companies are really embracing that idea. But you're right. It should be baked in. We should be talking about quality engineering and not a QA function who's a gatekeeper at the end of the process. Yeah. So here's a typical CI/CD pipeline that we see out there in the wild. It's missing that automated testing. So they've got the build automated, they deploy to QA, and then you've got a lot of manual testing, and someone can push a button and deploy to prod. And let me ask you this, how many people, as part of your automated testing in your CI/CD pipeline, how many people try to do Selenium and browser-based testing in the middle of a pipeline? Is performance ever an issue, or because what I've had customers come back to us and say, well, if I do a lot of Selenium testing and that takes more than 5 or 10 minutes, our developers get antsy. They want instant feedback. So how do you guys handle that?
Our test suite on Selenium, several $100.
So you don't do it within the pipeline?
Not with each pipeline.
Yeah.
You just
On-
run multiple
on
instances
many
on
servers,
Jenkins
but
and then
anyway.
you're good to go. It
Yeah.
takes like no longer than 10 minutes.
10 minutes, yeah. And that's what I see most companies comfortable with. If you can do it within 10 minutes, by all means, knock it out. If that's going to be a 20-minute test, maybe it's best left outside of the pipeline.
What is a .NET test?
.NET is just MS Build, whether you use MS Build or .NET. .NET test is like Maven test that just runs all your test classes. So if you want to do a .NET build, you're going to do .NET space build or MS Build
Yeah.
space build.
It's kind of the build verification.
Mhm,
Yeah.
Yep. So I don't have to belabor this. I think everyone understands how this works, right? Ideally, in a pipeline, you're going to check some code in that's going to trigger the build, whether you're using Selenium or you're using JUnit or some other testing tool. It's going to trigger the test. If the test fails, that's going to fire back. You're going to notify the developer that his code sucks. He's going to make a change, and then at the end of the day, everyone's happy because you ultimately enter into deployment. So Jenkins, I never knew before I was doing some of this research that Oracle was involved in Jenkins. Do people know that? Larry Ellison had his grubby little hands, involved with Jenkins. It used to be called Hudson, I guess, back in the day. Free and open source. Seems like it's very popular here, at least in this group. I know it's popular in the industry. Over 1,500 plugins available. Let me ask the people here that are using Jenkins, what was it? Was it because that was already decided before you got there? Is it because it's open source and companies like the fact that it's open source? Is it because of the number of plugins? What are the reasons people here like Jenkins as a CI/CD pipeline?
Open source and plugins.
Old stop of it.
Yeah.
Big
They were one of
community,
the
big
first
adoption.
adoptions.
They've had a very good adoption rate.
Yeah.
So.
And it's hard to beat free.
Right.
Right? Hard to
The
beat free.
integrations are also good with Jira and everything.
It's easy to
Yeah.
get a feel for it.
Yeah, a lot of integration, a lot of plugin support, for sure.
Big community, like you can find some tweaks,
There's
tips.
always answer in Stack Overflow.
Yeah. So, freestyle project versus GUI-driven build for anyone who hasn't used Jenkins. I think the pipeline project came out a couple years ago, wasn't it? You could do Jenkins pipelines as of like 2017. Before that, you were just doing freestyle projects and triggering one project to another. And the concept of pipelines, interestingly enough, I don't think it was even there 2 years ago. But now they're obviously becoming aware that you don't want to just build a lot of individual building blocks and then trigger each one together. They finally have embraced, at least as of 2 years ago, the concept that your pipeline really should be written as code, not as in discrete units. So for anyone who hasn't seen Jenkins, and I'm not a Jenkins expert, but I will tell you when you look at the interface, you know right away it's open source, because no company who wants to charge for their code is going to make it look like a Netscape browser circa 1988. And that looks like a Netscape browser back in the early days. But the thing about open source is it's very task focused. No bells and whistles, no shiny knobs. It's not like Excel where it's got 10 million features and you're going to use 2% of what's in the package. You're probably going to use everything that's presented to you as a user. So if you haven't done pipelines before, you just want to add that as a plugin. You want to go ahead and create a pipeline. And I remember the first time I did this, it was interesting because I got to this page and I'm like, okay, someone help me out here. I'm going to build my first Jenkins pipeline. What is it that they want from me? Where is my wizard approach? Are you going to work with Java? Are you working with .NET? So it's a little intimidating if you haven't used Jenkins before. The good news is there's 10 million videos and articles out on the internet. I would say 10% are good. The other 90% aren't so good. So you got to dig a little bit to do a script. basically, here's the concept of Jenkins pipeline. Agent is where you specify, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong for any of you Jenkins experts. You can pick an individual agent if you have a Jenkins farm. If you're just running this as a test on your laptop, I was doing it on my Mac. You can do it on Windows or Linux. You're just going to use agent any because it's only going to run on the one agent you have local on your machine, but you can send that to different agents, slave agents that you have. You've got the concept of stages, individual stages. You give a stage a name. That stage name is important because that's going to show up in your GUI in terms of whether that stage failed or not. That's going to be important because if you send a Slack webhook notice or an email or an SMS, that stage is important. The name that you say build doesn't mean it's actually building. Obviously, that's just a label. You can build a pipeline like this that does no actual work, and you can actually execute it. And so you're just going to see, hey, I got a pipeline that all it does is echo some screen to an output, and I can see the pipeline run. I think a year or so ago, they came up with Blue Ocean, which is, this starts to look like an attractive commercial package as opposed to the real Jenkins interface. Anyone using Blue Ocean on a regular basis here? It's a little easier to navigate. Snippet generator, I almost put in my, and I don't use GitHub a lot, but I almost put my user access token on here till I got smart and erased that. But it does for if you haven't used Jenkins before and you're brand new, you can go ahead and have it show you all the parameters that you need to put into any plugin that you add to Jenkins. So it'll kind of step you through if you haven't used Jenkins before. So if you haven't used Jenkins, here's a pipeline. Obviously, not much happens unless you grab some code from a code repository. In this case, it's Git. If you do your development.NET, how many people are Windows shops here versus LAMP, Linux, anyone Windows here?
Rough.
I was managing 2 different companies where it was all LAMP, Linux, and Apache, and MySQL. Once you're there and then you go back to Windows, that's a rough transition. I promise you that's rough. Just getting rid of Active Directory was kind of nice for a while, but now I'm back in that world. So I chose wrong. I went ahead and put a .NET reference in here instead of Maven. But if you're a .NET developer, .NET Restore just goes ahead and figures out all your dependencies, all your tools, and refreshes that file. .NET Build is actually going to build your .NET program just as if you're in Visual Studio. .NET Test is going to execute all the test classes, and then obviously if you got some program deployment, that's where you'd kick it off. The beauty here is that by default, if any step fails, the pipeline fails. So if you have some unit tests thrown in there and it fails, the developer doesn't have a way to bypass that. The challenge I've always seen in companies is if the testing is manual, you're kind of left at someone deciding, do I really want to listen to QA or am I going to push it anyway based on other needs? So it is nice that the pipeline automatically fails. And I mentioned here, if you're not using .NET, you'd probably use Maven. I would say adding, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong, I would say adding unit testing to a CI/CD pipeline is probably easier than it is to convince your development staff or your management to go ahead and employ the concept of unit testing. Anyone have feelings about that one way or the other? Anyone have challenges? Is it rather easy and straightforward to add unit testing to a CI/CD pipeline, or has anyone found that challenging? Are there issues that people here should be aware of if they haven't done it before?
I'd say the biggest challenge that we've had on that, because we're definitely trying to get into that fail fast kind of methodology, and unit testing gets you there, is the QA staff is a little more unfamiliar with the unit testing aspects. So trying to get them on board and part of the unit testing process has probably, more from a process standpoint, has probably been more of a struggle to, as we try to bring those tests closer, to bring the QA in closer to that.
And I think there's a lot of truth to that, because with the unit testing, that's where QA and developers really have to work hand in hand, right? if you're just doing browser-based testing, you're doing exploratory testing, you don't have to work very closely with those weird developer types, right? You're kind of on your own in a QA or staging environment. For unit testing, you really have to work hand in hand, and that collaboration and partnership really does need to be there. So the people that here that are using, let's say, Jenkins or CI/CD, how do you effectively communicate this back to your development teams? Are you using Slack channels? That's what we did at Ashley, and I just have an example here, but I'm kind of curious. What are people doing? How are people most effectively communicating back to their development teams? What are people
Usually
using?
Jenkins connector comes up under user story, saying that user story delivery is failed or passed.
And how do you communicate that out to the masses?
You mean the messenger?
Mhm.
Keep chat?
Yeah,
We use Slack.
Slack.
A
Yeah.
lot of Slack
Use
channels,
Slack,
a lot of, we were alerting on the side.
No Microsoft Teams
Yes.
users here?
I tried, but we had.
I hate Teams. We have to get rid of Slack.
But it's been historically horrible.
It's getting better.
It's getting a
It
lot better.
absolutely is
They
getting
realize
better.
their gaps.
Yeah.
They have
I
big
kind of
user
miss
base.
Skype. I actually thought
Yeah.
Skype was better than Teams, at least
Right.
from an interface perspective.
Now they're wagging it together
Yeah.
and trying to make it work.
Get a little bit
Now
better.
it's getting moving from Skype to Teams.
Well, they're whacking them together. Yeah.
So I think with the concept of DevOps, it gives us all an opportunity to really move away from the concept of QA and quality testing to quality engineering. From the beginning of the pipeline to the end, the message everyone here should be sending to your teams, to your IT departments is, we really need quality baked in. QA shouldn't be an afterthought. It's not that last hoop to jump through before deployment, but let's think about quality from the beginning. And so, to your point about QA and testing being built in, really what you want is a life cycle that involves testing in every aspect of your deployment. I think as we do more and more infrastructure as code, at some point we're going to realize after a couple failures, someone needs to test that infrastructure as code. Because the application could be right, but if you're doing blue-green deployment and you're going to deploy your web environment brand new every time you do a deploy, who's going to make sure that all the web servers are actually stood up and actually patched correctly before you deploy your application code? So I think we're a couple years away from that. But I think at some point we're going to say, well, we need to start testing our infrastructure as code, especially when you're going to treat everything as a pet, and every time you deploy, you destroy all your servers and provision new ones.
Actually, at scale, you cannot test your infrastructure. And at scale, you cannot test your production. So you just use your monitoring data and see everything's green. You know it will go.
Right, but my point is, if you're going to destroy your environment and rebuild it every time you deploy to start with net new, you're hoping that you're going to deploy on infrastructure that was deployed correctly. You hope that some solution and architect didn't edit that infrastructure as code,
It never happens.
make a mistake, under provision the web server and give you a test server with 1 CPU and 16 gig of RAM, and find out only after the customer complains that, boy, our infrastructure as code was bad and we didn't provision what we wanted to provision.
If SLIs and SLOs defined properly for deployments, and you have health checks all around that.
Yeah. So here, from my experience working in IT for a while, what the areas that I don't see being tested or talked about from a quality perspective is customer experience. I'm more sensitive to that because I've dealt with high volume websites that support 50,000 concurrent users at the same time, so customer experience is always very important. Performance, I don't see as much focus on performance as I would have thought that I'd see in security. We're starting to have more customers come to us and say, as part of our CI/CD pipeline, how do we run an analysis of the code and look for OWASP top 10 vulnerabilities and do that through the pipeline, as opposed to being hacked and finding out, oh, we built in those vulnerabilities and never looked at our code. So keep in mind as you build in CI/CD pipelines that what opportunities do you have to look for security defects in your code, in your systems before deployment. So what should you do during the planning phase? To me, I think it would be good at the start of a sprint when you're talking about user stories. If you want to get involved in unit testing, that might be a good time to talk about that. Here's a new user story. Are there any automated tests that can be built in to the application at that point in time? Because thinking about that after the fact is a little, it's not very productive. So if you want to do that, I would say at the start of the user story be the way to do it. I think QA always suffers from the silo issue, just like operation does. The more that anyone in the testing side can help break down those silos, the better. Through the test phase, a lot of people do the unit testing, a part of the CI/CD pipeline. Anyone here do API testing? All right, good. Just internal or also external? All internal APIs, I'm assuming?
Partner API and implementation.
Load performance testing. Anyone check the load before you deploy? The challenge, I see that on the screen. I've never wanted to pay for a QA environment that is the same level of beefiness as my production. And so the only way to really...
It doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make sense. Now you could argue with the web, you can provision, test, tear it all down, but not many of us have cycles to want to spend time doing that. So I think this is a little aggressive saying you can do all that kind of testing. I think most people would be happy if you did unit and API testing. You'd probably say we've got a pretty good handle on automated testing. Make sure you're always staying aware of the testing tools available. In terms of security testing, we've got a number of vendors that we're looking at. I don't think Fortify was one, but just be aware that at some point, especially if you're dealing with data that is compliance related, such as HIPAA, such as PII, such as PCI, that at some point you might need those code reviews being built into your pipeline. So what problems will it solve? Maybe nothing right away. I think QA sometimes has to make sure that they have a seat at the table when it talks to a company that is moving into the DevOps culture, that's moving into pipelines. You need to make sure QA is there from day one and not after the fact. It can help shift QA to the left earlier in the pipeline. The earlier the better, so that the developers can fix those defects and get those solved. I think it opens the door to continuous testing across the entire life cycle of development. It eliminates QA from being siloed and those individuals whose only satisfaction is to kill a system from going into production. So helps remove that that feeling of QA being the shop that stops quick deployment. And using CI/CD testing does become pluggable. I think it makes everyone aware that quality is an issue. I've seen so many developers focused on, boy, my code is cool, I write the best code, I write the most efficient code, and QA isn't necessarily on the top of their mind. Keep in mind, manual testing doesn't scale well, especially if you work for a small company and business is picking up, you're growing 10x, 20x, 100x. Manual testing doesn't scale that well. You can't always throw more bodies at it. That's not an effective way to grow. So automated testing does scale better with your business. Anyone familiar with the ice cream cone with automated testing? I always say avoid the ice cream cone. Most of us like ice cream. Beware the cone where you don't really focus on automated testing, doing unit testing. You have to work with the key development team. You kind of prefer to do your automated GUI tests with Selenium. What they always tell you is start with the automated unit testing first. That will give you your biggest return for the buck. Not easier said than done, not always easy to get the developers mindful of that. But they do say avoid the ice cream cone and just focus on unit tests first and then work your way up the period. This is going to be faster to implement and it requires a lot less integration than automated testing up the stack, so to speak. So what mistakes can I avoid? CI/CD pipelines automation doesn't mean let's just make the same mistakes even faster than before and make sure you're automating the right things. Avoid building a tool salad. I think elegant simplicity is a lot harder to do than complicated solutions. So don't be afraid to look for simplicity. And I think that's what like an Azure DevOps has to offer is sometimes getting one provider to provide all the tools and easy integration is something to be said. Ensure QA is not seen as a silo. Automate testing that is easily automated and leave the harder work for later. don't forget to test the infrastructure. And even if it's, has anyone thought about disaster recovery? Has anyone thought about high availability? It's amazing how many companies deploy into the cloud today, and we ask them, what do you guys do if Azure goes down? And they say, I don't know. But it only takes one outage, and then you realize, someone should have raised their hand and asked us to think about that and to test that. And so don't even just have a plan, but how do you test that plan and make sure it's right? Who's going to randomly take out a web server and make sure that another web server is going to be provisioned behind the load balancer if one is unhealthy? That's another part of testing that I think QA departments at some point should say, what if the load balancer fails? Do we have a remedy for that? I think QA departments should just be able to, in a test environment, randomly, and I think Netflix does this a lot with Chaos Monkey, if you lose part of your infrastructure, A, does anyone even know before a customer complains or an end user department complains, and is IT doing what they need to do to make these systems resilient?
I think in the high-tech and retail banking, you would see people doing those tests, but that is important. Even in something like Amazon, they would be doing that.
Well, any company that, we were talking to Next Tech Systems today, they do a lot of SaaS solutions for customers. So anytime you've got a customer interface that you have SLAs tied to, you definitely want to have that kind of resiliency.
I know when I used to work with PNC Bank, high-level testing, you have to do it. Yeah.
Absolutely. So best practices, break down the pillars, make sure you collaborate as a team, automate your infrastructure deployments as much as possible, avoid deployment via mouse click on a portal, and focus on your results and efficiency more so than on the specific tools. Importance of continuous testing. Continuous testing is better than automated testing. It creates quality release gates throughout the pipeline, provides timely feedback, and helps shift QA to the left to where it belongs. It enables quality at every step, and I think it helps create a culture of quality. So in summary, CI/CD automated testing challenges sometimes are more political than they are technical. A lot of great tools out there. Focus on quality engineering through the continual life cycle, and don't forget testing for customer experience, security, and performance. Thank you.
Great. Let's have a little bit of Q&A. You guys have any questions for Jeff?
Yeah, I know that we overstood the time a little bit, but yeah.
So those of you that are using Jenkins, do you have any advice for the people here that maybe haven't done automated testing, that haven't included testing in their CI/CD pipelines? Anything that you would do differently, or would look back and say, boy, if a company is going to start doing automated testing in a pipeline, here are the things to think about? Any words of wisdom? Or they're just going to suffer the same scars as everyone else?
Yeah,
Like it is ugly, and I don't know, but what should we use instead?
I'm sorry?
What should we use instead?
Instead of
Jenkins.
Oh, I'm saying no matter what tool.
Yeah.
I think Checkins is a great tool.
Yeah.
I was a little disappointed when we were forced to go the Microsoft route. I just hate those unilateral, hey, anything from company X, we're going to use their tool. We happen to like Checkins a lot, and I like the cost of Checkins, which is free. So I wasn't saying what are some things to avoid because of Jenkins. It's just because it's such a popular tool, more companies than not will be using Jenkins. Any words to the wise who are going to start using Jenkins?
I can say that when you use Jenkins as your CI/CD pipeline, do not use it to deploy to production, because in that case, if your Jenkins is compromised, your credentials to production can be.
Well, that's a good point. Everyone should be aware that when you start deploying CI/CD pipeline solutions, you got to work with credentials a lot. And you don't want to be one of those companies who stores credentials in a public GitHub repo, and then because I promise you, companies are sniffing through all those public repos looking for those credentials to get snagged. So I like the fact that you mentioned credentials, because you have to be aware that if you're going to automate, you need credentials to access your infrastructure, to access these third-party systems, and you want to make sure you do that securely.
And that's why systems like Code Pipeline on AWS or Azure DevOps is much better, because it integrates naturally with the cloud environment.
And a key vault, you can
need to store those credentials.
Yeah. All right.
I know it sounds obvious, but keep your JSON, your YAML, your code and your pipelines the same way you treat it with the other stuff. And there's so many companies that don't do that. They just think that this is the pipeline code, and they don't check it into a GitHub and
Right.
a repo.
No
Make sure your
version
best
control.
practices- right, version control and all of that, because you need your rollback, you need your branches, you need all the different same things a lot of times.
And same thing with infrastructure as code too.
That's what I was just gonna say.
Someone stores
They all
infrastructure as
land
code on
online.
their hard drive, and you're like, shouldn't
And
you
interestingly
be?
enough, they seemed to, when they first started adopting that, and they throw a YAML up there or something like that, they don't look at it like as the code, that the baby code that they're really trying to protect.
Right. Yeah. Good point.
The second version of Jenkins, they changed a lot in it. With the Jenkins file, you have a part of a branch, and all your branches can be built different ways if you need it.
Yeah.
Problem is, you cannot test it locally.
And Pipelines does a lot of the similar stuff when you integrate it with repo and,
Yeah, but as I said, probably you cannot test it before you put those changes.
So I saw you write on there Ansible and Terraform as declarative infrastructure as code tools to use. Do you think Terraform is going to be replacing Ansible and Puppet in Chef? Or do you think Terraform will sit side by side next to a Puppet?
I think Terraform will, if not already, be the more popular choice. I think it's going to be a competition between Terraform and what you see with Azure is their kind of horrible ARM templates. They're very JSON heavy, very verbose. You can't handle policy creation, so Azure and Microsoft came out with this concept of blueprints, which is getting a little bit better, where you can have a lot of your governance built in with policies, a lot of your RBAC definitions outside of ARM templates. And the great thing about blueprints is it maintains a tie. So let's say I use my blueprint version 1.5 and I provision out in Azure. It maintains that tie. So if I want to change that deployment, I change my blueprint and I say, go retrofit my deployed environment to the new spec.
Like
the problem with, so that's where Microsoft's going. Terraform isn't there yet. I think they will. A lot of people like Terraform just because people are getting behind it. As a third-party provider at Green Pages, we do a lot of automation. The challenge for us is we have to deliver artifacts to our customers. So does that mean we always live with ARM templates because everyone who's using Azure can be an ARM template? Do we use a Puppet? Do we use a Chef? Do we use a Terraform? And if a customer says, I don't use those artifacts, then we reverse engineer into ARM templates. It's kind of interesting, what's best for us versus what the customer expects. But
So I noticed you went through this whole talk without mentioning Docker, even though this is CI/CD.
Containers.
Containers or.
well, who
is that-
said containers have to be part of CI/CD?
I guess my question is, you seem like you're really a Windows shop. It seems like your background. So do you see Docker being picked up in the Windows environments, even though?
It does. We used, I would say at Ashley Furniture, we probably run 1,000 Docker instances a day. And we're a Windows shop.
Yeah.
Me personally, because I'm such a cloud person, and because I see companies agonizing sometimes over the complexity of Kubernetes and containers, what I wonder, and I've spoken to Microsoft engineers and AWS engineers, the whole joke about serverless computing is that that's containers behind the portal. What they want to do is they want to manage the containers for you. They want developers just to focus on code. Whether it's Go or Python or .NET, they want you just to submit code. Don't worry about containers. Don't even worry about the OS. Who gives a crap about Windows or Linux if I say, I wrote some code, it's talking to a database, it's doing XYZ. Do we care if it's Linux or Windows at that point?
Or if it's Python or whatever.
So I'm selfishly thinking, 2 or 3 years from now, is it that serverless computing flames out? And we're like, thank God we didn't ride that horse. Because I talk to companies like Malwarebytes, and they handle millions of end nodes that they manage through AWS. And they are 100% serverless because they don't want to try to scale, those kind of processes. So I just wonder, are we going to be singing the praises of Docker containers and Kubernetes 3 to 5 years down the road? Or are we saying, boy, serverless does everything we need it to do, And it's just abstracting the fact that containers are pushed beyond the portal, and I'm just shoving it code as much as I want. That's my only question.
Yeah, but all
So then,
companies.
like, I guess that's sort of where I am now. I mean, we're quite lean, so we are just writing business logic. I'm not worrying about doing DevOps, so I'm using Heroku. I'm using Heroku CI. It's all on GitHub. I'm not running my own Garrett server, Jenkins, any of this. At what point, aside from a cost factor, should I say, I need to step back, I need to set up my own infrastructure with Terraform? Or is it just purely, this is getting way too expensive on Heroku?
Yeah, I think a lot of times cost drives it, right? If you think you have the efficiency you need right there, then it's okay. Sometimes you have to think about what I always try to think about, and this is only because I've been a CIO and a CTO, is how long is that company going to be around? You know, and someone might say, you know what, I want to do technology X. And it's like, well, am I going to bet my career that that company is going to be around in 5 years? You know, that's the only thing. Heroku, is it going to be around? Probably. And that's the only other thing that I would, you know, sometimes.
Well, every CIO 20 years ago went to IBM. Gotta go blue.
Yeah.
Can't
Or
go
you got to
wrong.
go with SAP, and
Or
then the
SAP.
SAP project
Doesn't
crashed
matter
and
what it
burned, and the
costs.
CIO
Yeah,
got a new
PeopleSoft
job.
anymore. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know.
That's a
We see a lot of companies. I even mentioned before this session started, we have a company who wants us to help them deploy Docker containers across both Azure and AWS, and he wants to be able to span that workload. And you know, to me, it's hard enough to get talented people who understand one cloud environment or the other. So the fact that this is a large company, but then you got to have masters of both, and you're always lowest common denominator.
Are they doing that so that, for like you said, they don't want to put all the eggs in one basket? They really think that.
Well, when you're
one of those
spending
are
3 to
gonna go
5
away?
millions a year
Yeah,
on
yes.
infrastructure, you want to be able to flip the finger to
Yeah.
Amazon or AWS and say, you know what,
Sometimes
I just
more.
flipped the switch and I have just moved millions of dollars over to this other guy. So I don't think you would do that from a disaster recovery perspective, because
No,
you can be
no.
multi-region, but I think it is because Microsoft, once they have all your eggs, you know, they're not willing to negotiate very much because they know you're locked in. You know,
It's tougher.
And also
Some-
it can be dictated by customers.
In most cases,
Some
it's
customers
about
don't
money.
work with
We
Amazon,
also have
some
hybrid
work with
stuff in
AWS.
AWS and also
Yeah.
on-prem system.
Walmart
Yeah.
is the biggest
Because
example.
it's-
I get that, but when he's saying
We're
that
talking
companies
about
that want to do
the-
50-50, I'm trying to look at, you know,
Yeah,
because
if I'm selling something for retail,
like you said, it's kind of simplify this. Kubernetes everywhere, Docker,
Yeah.
you know, containers running, you know, these containers are those ones, these are that, and what am I deploying to? Is it going to be the same in both worlds?
Yeah.
You know, I mean,
it's like 98% of the same. But
Yeah.
2% will keep you awake.
2% keeps you up on Saturday morning.
all right, well, sorry if we kept you late, but I appreciate the invite.
Yeah, you good.
Appreciate
Thanks, man.
everyone coming out. And I think you're doing valet parking, right? You guys will pick up their car from the garage and bring it?
Yeah, whatever.
All right, awesome.
Whatever to
All
make
right,
it
thanks,
happy.
everybody.
Thanks for coming, guys.